Today, I want to talk about women's disclosure in relationships, especially at the beginning of the relationship stages. But quite honestly, this information can be helpful at any point. And this topic came from suggestions that I put in a YouTube poll here. So thank all of you who voted and gave some feedback to this. This is a response to that. I was actually really glad to make this one. So in today's conversation, as I said, I want to talk about the disclosure and the honesty gap. Again, specifically within early relationship formation, but again, it can also be applied at just about any point. Because listen, we don't want to wait until we're heavily invested, married, or even have a kid to figure out how she'll treat us when she leaves. This conversation can also help us to be more confident when we decide, hey, it's time for me to leave. It can also help, as you can imagine, with qualifying women when you are out there looking for a relationship or in the dating pool. So listen, we can't obviously force anyone to be honest, right? But we can create conditions that make fuller disclosure more likely and recognize important information when her filtering is reduced. So here's where we're going to go today with this conversation. We're going to talk about the core question or the core topic, and then I want to give you a little bit of information about what we can and cannot actually kind of detect given women's early propensity to disclose when we meet them. And then we'll talk a little bit about 3 different levels of disclosure. This has to do with the thumbnail. I'll share a little bit about that as well. And then why people do not reveal everything early. Some of that may be intuitive, but I want to make sure that we get that ground discussion there as well. Talk about how disclosure progresses, and then the most revealing early clues that you need to be looking for when you're out there. And then I'll also give examples of recommended questions or suggestions, better questions that you can ask to get to where we want to be as quickly as possible. And then I'll wrap it all up with a final takeaway. All right, so let's start with the core topic and the central issue here is identifying a woman's real beliefs early, because they typically emerge gradually when we meet people. Early dating represents an incomplete picture, right? Because both of you are choosing to disclose what feels safe, useful, and appropriate, right, at the time to reveal. So the question is, how do we close that honesty gap as quickly as possible by getting her to disclose important information and beliefs so that we don't waste our time or ruin our lives by being with her? So a statement such as, "I believe in equality," may be sincere on her behalf while not really answering anything at all about what equality, about parenting, money, or relationship roles, or even divorce even means. For a little context, Dindia and Allen's 1992 meta-analysis, I'll put the title up here on the screen for you. Their meta-analysis found that women disclosed somewhat more on average, but the pattern was contextual. And the strongest premise here is that people disclose selectively, and men have particular need to understand women's beliefs, as I mentioned, as quickly as possible. So early on, it's not simply whether she's open to sharing information. It's more about which subjects, how deeply held her beliefs and convictions are, and what beliefs she chooses to not fully disclose. So let's move on to the next part right here. What can we actually detect? What can we infer or determine? Now, it's not entirely difficult to assume a woman's broad ideological direction relatively early through her language, maybe her social circles and political orientation. A lot of that stuff is pretty obvious. Also, media preferences and judgments about other people. That can actually be a pretty good one. Now, those are the easy ones, though. But exposing the strength of her beliefs takes some conscious effort because it's not always overt. So what remains harder is detecting the depth and breadth of her beliefs. What we're looking for in those early stages is to expose a few things. First, how strongly she holds a belief. Now, a mild preference and a rigid comment can sound very similar at times. 2 people may repeat the same thing, or one person may say the same thing at different times or within different contexts, while attaching very different meanings to it. And second, whether she applies her beliefs or standards or boundaries consistently. Right? So listen, she may oppose gender stereotypes when they resist women, but rely heavily on them when they impose obligations on men or allow her to avoid accountability. The important thing to notice is whether her belief or value is consistent for herself and others, not whether the abstract idea seems to make sense. And third, what she believes when it's personal to her. Now listen, abstract beliefs about equality are easier to express and agree with than a measurable outcome. So while her self-interest doesn't necessarily directly imply dishonesty, it is an important test of how stable her principles are. In this area, Swan and Grills, again, I'll put this up on the screen, their 1997 research found that relationship involvement could increase confidence in understanding a partner without reliably increasing accuracy. So, for example, you may identify the general neighborhood, let's say, of her worldview while being wrong about its intensity and expectations that she's willing to concede. Let's talk a little bit about 3 levels of disclosure. I'm going to put an image up here and kind of explain this as I go. By the way, this isn't a formal model. This is just my interpretation of a visualization that I put together for this discussion. So if you go looking for some of these terms or this model online or in research, you're probably not going to find it. I developed it specifically for this discussion. Anyway, let's move on to a more direct look into levels of disclosure, which typically follow a predictable progression. The first is what I'm going to call baseline. The baseline is what she's willing to disclose in general, including loose beliefs and expectations. Now, she may not always disclose these, but they're the baseline that she'll often share without even thinking about it. It's just natural for her to have these conversations. For example, labels such as traditional personalities, avoidant, or bare minimum, those all identify a broad type of belief system, but not the full structure or priority of her views. And then we have what we call, or what I refer to as, the presented baseline. And her presented baseline is her lowered disclosure level when getting to know you, right? This is where she's kind of refraining a little bit. Here, early statements are often even more broad, more limited, and more socially acceptable than her normal baseline, right? So, for example, every case is different, she'll tell you. Relationships require equal effort. And yes, of course, fathers are important. And these statements may be honest from her, but they're intended to not offend you. And they tell you very little because they're obviously extremely vague. And within the research here, Omarzu's disclosure decision model proposes that people weigh expected benefits of disclosure against interpersonal risk. Again, some of this may be intuitive, but I just want to give you the sources here. So as it relates here, early dating makes strong or controversial beliefs costly because you're both still evaluating each other. General language and vague values disclosure can therefore be much safer than precise beliefs and extreme admission, right? But what we're looking for are the beliefs that she exposes that are above her baseline. And again, this is obviously what I call above baseline. Check on the screen here. So this is the higher risk material that would typically soften, or she would keep all to herself, right? Something that she's not willing to discuss just in general. And these are beliefs that show up in this part of the disclosure gap shown here again on screen. Now, these include beliefs such as a strongly negative view against men. Maybe it's full agreement with feminist beliefs. Even something like resentment toward former partners or husband or boyfriends. Even gendered double standards and an expectation of men's financial provision. And what we want to do is get there as quickly as possible without being overtly confrontational. We want to get to that spot. Let's talk a little bit about why people don't reveal everything early. Again, a little bit intuitive, because there's a reason that people don't outright consciously disclose everything right away. She may withhold disclosure of her beliefs or boundaries, standards, whatever, for things like fear of rejection. Maybe it's uncertainty about early dynamics between the two of you. Maybe it's simple conflict avoidance. She's looking for or protecting her privacy, or she just doesn't think it's relevant, important to discuss. For example, she may have a very strong belief that mothers are always the better parent, but she'll never mention it until marriage, children, or a real separation is conceivable in her mind. So here in research, this 2022 study on self-silencing found that withholding thoughts to reduce relationship conflict was extremely common among both men and women. I don't think that's too surprising. But it was also associated with lower authenticity and worse conflict outcomes. So if she's holding back on you like that, It's not a good thing. And we'll get to the extremely valuable topic of conflict as it relates to disclosure in just a moment. But according to this report, silence may preserve immediate harmony while leaving an important disagreement totally unresolved. So keep in mind that her disclosure also depends on your response and your reactions to her. So let's talk a little bit about how disclosure progresses, because it doesn't follow a universal timeline, as you can imagine. It changes when her perceived risks and benefits change within the relationship and how quickly trust is developing. Let's talk about trust here. So deeper disclosure is safer when your disagreement with her disclosure is met without humiliation, attack, or immediate rejection. And this is the part that I want you to hear very, very closely. Her increased trust and continued disclosure do not require your agreement with her beliefs. It requires her to have confidence that you won't freak out when she does disclose a potentially unpopular view. So what we learn from research is that she'll speak more freely when she believes you share her opinion, or again, at least you don't attack her for it. So use this to your advantage. A small comment about her ex, maybe a previous divorce, or toxic masculinity can function as a test. It's very good learning material for us. And a non-threatening response on your part may produce a much more direct disclosure on her part. So listen, even if you don't agree with her, if you want her to continue deeper disclosure, just don't block her out at this point. So let's talk about the next step when the relationship starts to become more serious. Commitment can also make it easier for her to disclose more deeply by reducing the expected cost of revealing a controversial belief, because now you're less likely to leave. She's got you. So her feelings of security change her disclosure calculation, let's call it. And we'll even see more willingness to disclose above baseline when the topic is specific and personally relevant to her. So her abstract beliefs become more revealing when they're applied to real issues about things like, again, marriage, children, work, money, and other stuff. Because then equal parenting is discussed with real examples. Something like traditional values becomes a concrete list of her expectations regarding gender roles and responsibilities. So we're at this point getting to the specifics, right? So let me make this point right here. And this is my favorite part of this discussion about conflict. Because conflict may expose, in fact, very likely will, many times, expose previously filtered beliefs. So conflict can reduce her filter levels and narrow the gap between private belief and open expression. Now, of course, this is not a perfect truth serum. People do, of course, exaggerate, overgeneralize, or choose hurtful language when they're in a conflict, right? But even a single angry statement is evidence, and extremely valuable at that. So pay attention to what she says and does when she's angry, because that's when she's above her baseline of disclosure. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about revealing early clues. The strongest clues are recurring patterns rather than isolated jokes or comments. So again, be conscious of beliefs that she states that are stated multiple times, if not necessarily in succession. And here's a few things to look out for. Again, this is just a list. You probably can think of several on your own as well. Pay attention to how she describes former partners. Listen for accountability, perspective taking. For example, is every former boyfriend or husband a controlling prick? Can she identify a legitimate difference of perspective or anything that she contributed? Some ex-partners, yes, I understand, genuinely do behave very poorly. So the useful evidence is the pattern across several stories, not just one case. Again, just to make sure, what we're looking for is getting her to disclose information. Another one that we want to look at that could be really important for us is how she evaluates other couples. So what is she saying about them? And it's likely that she'll reveal beliefs more freely when it's not directly between you and her. She'll disclose more when she's talking about another couple than when she's referring to you and her. Right? For example, it could be increased disclosure of her beliefs when it's about friends, celebrities, or even news stories because they don't feel personal to her. So those judgments can still expose what she believes about custody, believe all women, and how oppressed she thinks that women are. Pay attention when she's talking about these things. Another thing that we want to pay attention to is whether principles are consistent when the sexes are reversed. Right? So we're talking basically double standards here. Does she believe that a lower earning husband deserves the same post-divorce financial support as a lower earning wife? Now, I get it, legitimate sex differences, sometimes they do matter, but dramatic judgment changes under otherwise comparable facts suggest a gender bias rather than a universal principle or belief. I would recommend, here's another one, paying attention to whether her behaviors match her statements. I've discussed something similar in previous videos before, because behavior gives more practical understanding than abstract statements, especially again early when in the dating and meeting stages. Simply saying that boundaries, respect, or equal parenting matter is far less important than consistently acting upon them when it's inconvenient for her. One consistency may prove very little, but a stable behavioral pattern, now that deserves attention. So let me give you some examples of better questions to ask and how to approach this to get her to disclose more, again, so we can decide if we want to stick around with her or not. As we have been mentioning, broad questions invite socially desirable answers. Specific scenarios, on the other hand, they reveal the rules, their limits, and whether it applies in both directions, right? So again, back to the double standards part of this conversation. Right, so let me give this example for custody. What should the normal arrangement be when both parents are equally competent, they're both involved, they're safe, and they're both nearby? What are her thoughts about that? What about spousal support, right? Ask her how and when it's justified, how long it should last, and whether the same rule applies again when the husband has sacrificed his career. What about, again, former relationships? Asking things like what the ex-partner would identify as the largest problem, right? If you're going to call and talk to her ex, what would he say? And again, how about gender expectations and asking things like which traditional responsibilities men should retain and which women should retain? And don't ever forget that conflict lowers her filter. That's when it's time to really, really step back and pay attention to her. It's when she's saying things that she'd likely never say otherwise. Let me just tell you this. It doesn't have to be, again, an interrogation. It could just be a simple follow-up question to one thing, and that's it. To learn as you go. So again, asking concrete rather than abstract questions. A question like, do you believe in equality? That simply reveals almost nothing, to be honest. In specific situations involving children, money, responsibilities, and former partners, any double standards, those are much, much more helpful for you. Get to the specifics. And what we also want to do is pay attention when subjects become personally relevant, as I mentioned. General beliefs become more informative when they must be converted into actual real-life scenarios and decisions. Also, listen carefully during conflict, as I've mentioned. Conflict can reduce filtering and expose assumptions, along with resentment or expectations that were previously expressed more cautiously. Us guys, we are often, it's very true, don't like to admit it all the time, we're not always great communicators, and we're not always the best at intuitively or even consciously getting information out of women, because let's be honest, a lot of times we're just happy to have a woman in our life and we don't want to fuck it up. But if you want to filter for a woman, get rid of one that may not be healthy for you, this disclosure, this honesty gap, I think can be really, really helpful. I hope that the model that I put together makes sense. Again, give me your thoughts. I'd love to know them, and I'll see you soon.